Imagine you are standing at the entrance of a stone corridor in the heat of an Indian afternoon 2,000 years ago. The air is thick with the smell of crushed marigolds and burning oil. Drums pulse somewhere inside. A crowd presses against you. Farmers, merchants, beggars, all waiting for the same thing. The gates open and then they stop you. You are not allowed in. Forget the serene temples you have seen in illustrations, the meditative spaces, the open sanctuaries of spiritual equality. That version was never real. What stood at the center of ancient Indian civilization around 100 BCE to 200 CE was not a place of peace. It was a machine, built from stone, fed by labor, and operated by a priestly class with absolute control over who could approach the divine and who would die never having seen it. A single major sanctuary in this period could own the land of dozens of surrounding villages. It employed hundreds of people. It collected taxes. It settled legal disputes. And at its core, in a chamber so small only one man could enter, sat the deity, bathed, clothed, and fed 3 times a day, while outside ordinary people waited in silence for a handful of ash. Most of what was lived inside these walls was never written down. The systems, the fear, the negotiations between the powerful and the desperate filtered out of scripture, smoothed over by centuries of reverence. What was it truly like to exist inside that world? And what did the sacred cost the people who could never reach it? To understand what temples and sanctuaries were really like in ancient India 2,000 years ago, you have to first understand what the subcontinent itself was. This was not a unified empire at its height. The great Maurya dynasty, which had once stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bengal Delta, had already fractured by the 2nd century BCE. In its place rose a mosaic of competing kingdoms, the Shungas in the north, the Satavahanas in the Deccan, the Cheras, Cholas, and Pandyas in the deep south, each controlling territory, each demanding loyalty, each building sacred structures not simply as acts of devotion, but as declarations of political permanence. The population of the subcontinent at this time is estimated to have been between 30 and 50 million people, scattered across river valleys, trade routes, and jungle clearings. Life expectancy for a person born into a laboring family rarely exceeded 30 years. Monsoon failure meant starvation within a season. Disease moved through settlements without warning and without mercy. In this world, where the body was fragile and the future uncertain, the temple was not optional. It was the only institution that claimed to mediate between the living and whatever controlled their fate, and it charged accordingly. Regional kings and merchant guilds funded construction on a scale that defied the poverty surrounding it. Inscriptions carved into sandstone at sites across the Deccan and northern plains record donations of land, grain, cattle, and gold, not as anonymous charity, but as public declarations of status. To build a temple was to announce power. To endow a sanctuary was to buy proximity to the divine, and through that proximity, legitimacy over the people who depended on it. The economics of sacred architecture in this period were inseparable from the economics of control. Stone did not rise from faith alone, it rose from calculation. If you feel this journey into the past is worth taking, leave a like and consider subscribing. Every new viewer who joins this channel helps keep this kind of documentary history alive. Now, settle in. Turn down the lights if you can. What comes next is not a story you were taught in school. The priests who operated these sanctuaries belonged to lineages that had accumulated power across generations, and by the period between 100 BCE and 200 CE, that power had calcified into something approaching a legal system of its own. Access to the deity was not a matter of personal faith. It was a matter of ritual purity, as defined by birth and birth alone. The Brahmin priest did not simply perform ceremonies. He stood as the single authorized channel between the world of human need and the world of divine response. Without him, the sacrifice was invalid. Without him, the prayer reached nothing. He knew this. The kingdom knew this. And the farmer standing barefoot in the outer courtyard, holding his offering of rice and flowers, knew this too. Inside the inner sanctum, the Garbhagriha, the womb room, the deity existed as a living presence, not a symbol. The murti was not considered a representation of a god. It was considered the god, made present through consecration rituals that only the priestly class could perform and only they could sustain. This distinction carried enormous consequence. It meant that the priest did not serve the deity on behalf of the community. He controlled access to the deity. He decided when it was visible, when it was not, what it required and what it would grant. The spiritual life of tens of thousands of people flowed through a single narrow gate, and that gate was never opened without a price. Temple lands in this period were exempt from royal taxation in many regions, a privilege negotiated between palace and priesthood in a relationship of mutual reinforcement. The king received the legitimacy that came from being seen as a protector of sacred sites. The priest received land revenue, legal protection, and institutional permanence. Between them, they constructed a system in which ordinary people had no leverage, no recourse, and no alternative. To question the temple was to question the divine order itself, and the divine order, as everyone understood, had teeth. Droughts were explained as divine punishment. Disease was framed as ritual failure. The fear of cosmic consequence was as effective as any army in maintaining compliance. What this meant in practice was that the temple functioned as a parallel government. Disputes between merchants were settled at its gates. Weights and measures used in local markets were sometimes calibrated and certified by temple administrators. Loans were issued by temple treasuries against future harvests. Records of land ownership, inheritance, and debt were maintained on copper plates stored in the sanctuary's archives. The institution that claimed to connect the human to the eternal was also, quietly and completely, the institution that managed the granary, adjudicated the inheritance, and collected the fine. Step outside the temple precinct, and the world that surrounds it does not offer comfort. In the settlements that clustered around major sacred sites between 100 BCE and 200 CE, the physical environment was defined by proximity to the institution at its center. The temple was the tallest structure in sight. In the earliest phases of stone construction, many sanctuaries were still partly timber and brick, but the shikara, the rising tower above the inner chamber, was beginning its long vertical climb, announcing from a distance the presence of power that could not be ignored. The streets leading to the main gates were never quiet. They were occupied from before dawn until well after dark by a permanent economy of devotion. Garland sellers spreading jasmine and lotus across low wooden tables, vendors of clarified butter in terracotta pots, musicians hired for ceremonial processions, beggars positioned at intervals along the approach road because the act of giving before entering the temple was considered spiritually advantageous. The smell of the approaching sanctuary was not the smell of incense alone. It was the smell of open cooking fires, animal dung from the cattle brought for sacrifice, unwashed bodies in the heat, and the particular sweetness of flowers left too long in the sun. The residential areas surrounding the temple were divided in ways that were not subtle. Those who served the institution lived closest to it: priests, ritual specialists, musicians, attendants who managed the deity's daily schedule of bathing and feeding and dressing. Their houses were small but permanent, built from brick or dressed stone, with access to water from wells maintained by temple administration. Farther out, the residences changed character. Merchants who had prospered from the pilgrimage trade occupied solid structures near the main roads. Beyond them, the majority of the settlement lived in conditions that the buildings themselves made clear: reed and mud construction, earthen floors, shared courtyards where multiple families cooked, worked, and slept in close proximity. The sounds of this world layered without relief. Temple bells rang at fixed hours throughout the day and night, marking the deity's schedule of attention, which took precedence over everything else. The rhythmic slap of grinding stones began before sunrise in every household that had grain to process. Animals moved through the narrow lanes: goats, cattle, dogs, negotiating space with water carriers, fuel gatherers, and children running errands before the heat made movement impossible. The air itself was an assault. Smoke from a dozen types of burning fuel, the iron tang of butchered animals near the sacrifice ground, the muddy richness of standing water in the lanes after rain. To be poor in this environment was to be permanently visible and permanently ignored. The physical layout of the sanctuary made the social order architectural. The closer you stood to the inner chamber, the more you mattered. The farther you remained from the gate, the clearer the message. The people who built these sanctuaries, who carried their offerings to the outer courtyard and waited for whatever portion of divine attention the system allowed, lived lives of unremitting physical labor. In the agricultural settlements that surrounded major temple sites, the rhythm of existence was determined not by religious calendar, but by the demands of the land and the obligations owed to those who controlled it. A family farming a plot adjacent to temple-owned land might owe a portion of every harvest as ritual tithe, a separate portion as royal tax assessed by a local administrator, and a further contribution in labor, clearing land, maintaining irrigation channels, carrying stone for construction projects initiated by patrons seeking spiritual credit. The diet available to most people in this period was narrow and unreliable. Rice, millet, and lentils formed the base of nearly every meal for those who could not afford anything else. Vegetables grown in small plots near the home supplemented this when the season permitted. Meat was available but ritually complicated. Certain castes could not consume it. Certain animals could not be slaughtered near temple precincts, and the general scarcity of surplus meant that animal protein was not a regular feature of most lives. Children in these settlements were expected to contribute to household labor from an age that would register as shocking by modern measure. Tending animals, fetching water, assisting in field work before the bones were fully formed. Women in this world carried a weight that the historical record largely refused to acknowledge. They managed the domestic economy of the household, grinding grain, maintaining the cooking fire, preserving food across seasons, managing water, caring for children and elderly simultaneously. Their access to the temple was regulated by ritual status. Menstruation rendered a woman impure under Brahminic law, which meant that a significant portion of adult female life was spent in a state of formal exclusion from the most important institution in the community. The spiritual lives of women were not absent, but they were conducted in spaces the official record did not find worth describing. Household shrines, local sacred trees, riverbanks where daily prayers were offered without priestly mediation and without cost. Disease moved through these populations with a regularity that the bodies of the survivors recorded permanently. Skin conditions, respiratory illness from smoke-filled interiors, parasitic infections from contaminated water, the particular devastation of childhood dysentery. These were not exceptional misfortunes. They were the background condition of existence. A woman who survived to 40 had likely buried at least one child. A man who lived to the same age had likely worked through injuries that modern medicine would have treated and resolved in days. None of this appears in the inscriptions carved into temple walls. The inscriptions record donations. They record the names of kings and merchants who gave. They record the virtues of patrons and the gratitude of institutions, the people whose labor made the stone rise, whose tithes fed the treasury, whose prayers sustained the institution's claim to relevance. They left no text. They left only the buildings themselves, standing in the heat, enormous and indifferent. 2,000 years have passed since a farmer stood at the outer edge of a temple courtyard in the Deccan Plateau and looked toward a gateway he was not permitted to cross. The stone he stood on is still there. The gateway is still there. Pilgrims still walk the same approach roads, still leave flowers at the same thresholds, still press their hands against walls that were dressed and fitted by hands that received nothing for the labor except the assurance that the act itself was sacred. What survives is always the structure. What disappears is always the person. The temple endures because stone is harder than memory, and institutions outlast the bodies that sustain them. But inside every surviving sanctuary, inside every chamber that still holds the smell of oil and ash and ancient consecration, there is a silence that the architecture itself cannot explain. It is the silence of everything that happened here that no one thought worth recording. The transactions, the refusals, the fear, the exhaustion, the small and unspectacular acts of devotion performed by people who had nothing to offer except the offering itself. This world did not ask to be understood, it asked only to be endured, and most of the people who lived inside it had no choice but to comply, season after season, harvest after harvest, birth after death after birth. beneath towers of stone that rose higher with every generation and grew no more merciful with the height.